evening, and welcome to Blood Ties and Bedside Tales, where we talk about true crime, love stories, the paranormal, and everything between. The case we're covering tonight is one that is deeply unsettling, not just because of the brutality in which each of the victims endured, but because it remains unsolved to this day, going on 48 years, actually unsolved. And we're going to be covering the case of the Connecticut River Valley Killings. I first heard about this case when I was watching an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, the original series hosted by Robert Stack. So if you have seen the original Unsolved Mysteries series on TV and you watch that episode, then you're most likely going to recognize this case, or maybe you heard about this case somewhere else. And actually, all of the original Unsolved Mysteries episodes are available on YouTube now. So if you want to take a walk down memory lane and revisit Unsolved Mysteries, it's available on YouTube. But before we get into it, if you're new here, please consider subscribing to our channel so you don't miss an episode from us. Give us a like if you like this video and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our new uploads. And let's get into tonight's story. So let's start by just giving a little bit of background about the area where this took place. So the Connecticut River Valley is the longest stream in New England. And I didn't know this, but New England is a northeast region of the United States, comprising of the states Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut.
Mm-hmm.
The river covers an area of about 11,000 square miles and runs through a bunch of different terrain, including the built-up city of Middletown, Connecticut, and the farmlands of Sunderland, Massachusetts. The river valley itself runs through New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, and Connecticut, and in varying parts of this region, the landscape is just absolutely beautiful. If you live on the East Coast, you know this, or if you're familiar with what the East Coast kind of looks like in fall, you think the really vibrant reds, oranges, greens, and yellows, of the leaves. That's what it can look like in this region. It's really pretty. The East Coast is known for just being really beautiful. So this region does get really, really beautiful during the different seasons. This case, however, mainly occurred near Route 91, bordering Vermont and New Hampshire. And like our last case that we covered, this region is known for its picturesque small towns and cities whose historical roots run deep, and life for the most part is pretty calm and quiet. Although the Connecticut River Valley region has, kind of different cities and landscapes and everything depending on what state you're in. In the late 70s and 80s, the peace in that region cracked when multiple women, turned up missing and were later found to be murdered. And a suspected serial killer was on the loose and terrorizing this region.
To fully understand how long this case has gone unsolved and the number of victims' lives the killer has claimed, let's go over the timeline. Between 1978 and 1987, 7 women were murdered across New Hampshire and Vermont. Their bodies were found within a 50-mile radius and all died the same way, being stabbed to death. Historically, when there are multiple victims that are found in or around the same area and the method in which they were killed are the same, this often leads investigators to suspect that a serial killer might be operating in that particular area and committing those murders. So the first victim in this string of murders was 26-year-old Catherine Milliken, or Kathy. Kathy was an artist, a photographer, an ornithologist, and a national sailing champion. This is what John R. Element wrote in his article about Kathy in 2025. John was a journalist for the Boston Globe. And for those who don't know, and I was one of them, who don't know what an ornithologist is, it's someone who studies birds, their behavior, their ecology, their physiology, and their conservation. On October 28, 1978, Kathy reportedly left work and went to the Chandler Brook wetland, which is now called the Esther Courier Wildlife Management Area, located in New London, Connecticut. It was reported that one of Kathy's interests was birdwatching. And as an ornithologist, it made sense. This was her thing. She was there photographing birds. However, the next day, Kathy's body was found about a few feet in the woods, not far from where she was last seen taking pictures. Kathy had sustained over 20 stab wounds in her neck, chest, back, abdomen, and in her thighs. The next victim was Mary Critchley. On July 25th, 1981, 37-year-old University of Vermont student Mary Elizabeth Critchley was dropped off by a friend near exit 13 on the Massachusetts Turnpike. And Mary decided to hitchhike to her home in Waterbury, Vermont, where she lived with a friend. Her body would later be found on August 9, 1981, in the woods on Unity Stage Road in Unity, New Hampshire, which was about 80 miles from where she was last seen. An autopsy was performed on Mary. However, the medical examiner was not able to determine what caused Mary's death because of the condition that her body was found in. It was just too decomposed. After Mary Critchley, there would be about a 3-year gap before a third body would be discovered. The next victim after the 3-year hiatus would be 26-year-old Ellen Ruth Fried or Freed. For the sake of this episode, I'll say Fried. Sometimes they're pronounced either Freed or Fried. Ellen was a registered nurse from Claremont who worked at Valley Regional Hospital. One evening, she called her sister from a payphone at the local Leo's Market and mentioned that a car was circling the parking lot. Ellen briefly stepped away from the phone to check if her car would start for whatever reason. She ended up saying goodbye to her sister. That would be the last time anyone would hear from Ellen. Later that September, in 1984, Ellen's skeletal remains would be found 8 miles outside of Claremont on the banks of the Sugar River in an isolated area, and just 1 mile from where another victim's remains would be found, Bernice Quartermanch. Ellen's autopsy would reveal a similar cause of death to Bernice, death by stabbing. Another victim, Linda Moore. On April 15th, 1986, 36-year-old mother of 2, Linda Moore, was found by her husband dead on their living room floor. According to investigators, there were no signs of forced entry, and the house did not seem like it had been ransacked. Linda suffered more than 20 stab wounds all over her body. This was a bit different because from, comparing it to the previously discussed victims, Linda was found in her home and not in a remote location. Another victim, perhaps the youngest documented victim in this crime spree, would be 17-year-old Bernice Quartermanch. I hope I'm not mispronouncing her last name. Sometime in 1984, Bernice hitchhiked to her boyfriend's house. 2 years later, on April 19, 1986, Bernice's skeletal remains would be found, and her autopsy would reveal she had been, you guessed it, stabbed to death. Eva Morse. On the morning of July 10th, 1985, 27-year-old Eva Morse was hitchhiking on Route 12 in North Charleston, New Hampshire. Her remains weren't discovered until later on in April 25th the following year. Her remains were discovered in the woods of Unity, New Hampshire, several miles from where she was last seen. Her body was discovered just 500 feet from where Mary Elizabeth Critchley was found. And an autopsy revealed that Eva had been stabbed and her throat was slit. The last confirmed murder victim was 39-year-old nurse Barbara Anu. On January 10, 1987, Barbara was on her way back home after spending the day skiing with some friends at Stratton Mountain in Vermont. She was driving her green BMW along I-91 north when she ran into a winter storm, which was common around this time of year in New England. Investigators speculated that Barbara either pulled over to use the bathroom or to scrape ice and snow off of her car. Barbara's car was later found abandoned in the next town over at a rest area called the White River Junction. Her family found this odd because she was so close to being home. It's not clear if Barbara pulled over at the rest area at her own will or if she was lured or forced to do so. Everything took a turn for the worse when Barbara's body was discovered near an apple tree in a wooded area in Heartland, Vermont. On her, investigators found her ski bib and her lift ticket. The coroner's report revealed that Barbara sustained a traumatic head injury and multiple stab wounds. The brutality dealt to her was similar to that of the 6 other previously documented victims of the Connecticut River Valley Killings. At this point, investigators started to notice a pattern. The victims were all women traveling alone, found near remote roads, and stabbed repeatedly. The murders also took place under the cover of darkness or in inclement weather, which unfortunately made it difficult to find any witnesses. However, this all changed in the summer of 1988 when a woman named Jane Boroski would suffer a similar fate. However, Jane would survive the attack despite being stabbed 27 times and being 7 months pregnant at the time of the attack.
On the night of August 6, 1988, 22-year-old Jane Boroski was on her way home from the Cheshire County Fair when she stopped at a convenience store to grab a soda. This was still the summer, so actually, according to the Unsolved Mysteries episode, they described it as really hot and muggy. I can imagine it's summertime. It must be really humid. So, she was parched and she just wanted to stop by and grab a soda before heading home. So Jane pulled over to this convenience store, got her soda, and was just drinking it in her car. And Jane at this time was also 7 months pregnant with her daughter. All of a sudden, Jane would later describe a golden brown Jeep Wagoner pulling up beside her. And initially, there was virtually no crime in the area. And so, she wasn't immediately concerned when she no longer was the only one in this parking lot of the convenience store. When the Jeep parked, a man who was driving the Jeep walked up on the side of Jane's driver's side of her car, which was unlocked, and asked her if the payphone was working. He then opened Jane's door and tried to take her out, most likely to abduct her like the previous 7 victims had been, except for Linda Moore. But the majority of the victims seemed to be abducted. At one point, Jane leaned back to kick him, but instead kicked out and smashed her windshield instead. The stranger then pulled out a knife and said, quote, "Maybe this will persuade you to get out of the vehicle." When Jane stepped out of the car, the man accused her of beating up his girlfriend and asked, quote, "Isn't this a Massachusetts car?" Confused, Jane insisted that she didn't know his girlfriend and that she had New Hampshire plates. After going back to the back of her car and seeing that the car indeed had New Hampshire plates and not Massachusetts plates, the strange man started walking back towards his car. Again, she was just really confused. And at that point, Jane mentioned that she didn't really feel threatened anymore. She thought that the guy had the wrong person. She had never met this guy in her life. And yeah, she was just really confused as to why he was asking her all these weird questions. But then Jane made a decision that she would later regret. After the damage that was caused to her windshield had been done, she asked the man what was to come of the damage because she was just there in her car, drinking the soda, not bothering anyone. He was the one who came up on the side of her car and started kind of struggling with her. And, in order to fight back and protect herself, of course, she kicked him. And to the point where she accidentally smashed her windshield. So she was kind of like, hey, what, all this for nothing? Like, are you going to fix the damage to my car that you pretty much caused because you came up to me? But when she kind of beckoned back to him, that's when the encounter a turn for the worst. The man came back to the side of the car where Jane was standing and put the knife up to her neck. Understandably, Jane was terrified, and she suddenly made a break for it when she saw headlights approaching on the main road. However, running to flag the car down for help, it drove right past her, and the stranger tackled Jane to the ground. On her back with the man on top of her, he proceeded to stab Jane 27 times. And in the Unsolved Mysteries episode, it says 18 times, but in doing research for this episode, Jane mentioned that she was stabbed a total of 27 times. So, kind of differing details there. And like I said before, Jane was 7 months pregnant at this time, so she was desperately trying to protect her baby. And, Jane described that finally, after what felt like forever, the attacker stopped and, according to her, quote, calmly got up and walked away. Jane heard the attacker's vehicle start, and as she rolled over to her hands and knees to get up, the man slowly drove by looking at her and drove off into the night. Jane said, quote, he didn't speed off, he just drove away, end quote. And we actually have some of the Unsolved Mysteries episode that we want to play. And it picks up where Jane is talking about, she got up on her hands and knees, and she had a friend who lived nearby. So she was like, okay, I got to get up. I got to get to my friend's house so that I can possibly get some help. So we're going to go ahead and play that.
Friend's house to get help.
Although Jane had been stabbed or slashed a total of 18 times, she somehow managed to crawl back to her car and drive to a friend's house 2 miles away.
When I left the parking lot, I felt like I was going fast. I was driving fast. I was in shock, of course, so I'm really not sure how fast I was driving. But evidently pretty fast, because before I knew it, I was right behind him. And as I was behind him, all I could think about was he was going to stop, or he was going to turn around and follow me. He left me for dead. I know he left me for dead. No doubt about that.
When Jane reached her friend's house, her attacker drove on.
Frank! Frank!
Up the road, the attacker turned back. He stopped momentarily in front of the house, then disappeared into the night.
Can I just say that I really enjoyed watching Unsolved Mysteries back in the days because of the original narrator, Robert Stack. I think the new Unsolved Mysteries, it's just not the same. It's just not the same, I always looked forward, and I remember it would come on Thursdays. I would always look forward to watching Unsolved Mysteries. I would be on the phone with my ex-boyfriend. And but all jokes aside, in all seriousness, I just, it's kind of weird because this situation or this incident with Jane is just not like the previous victims, right? I mean, he's talking about the attacker was talking about Jane having done something to his girlfriend, and then thankfully he didn't kill her, right? Although she was stabbed 27 times, I'm glad she survived. But the previous victims, they obviously didn't survive. So I don't know. I just don't know if this is the same guy.
Yeah. So we'll talk about this a little bit later, but when Jane, healed and everything from the attack, investigators let her know that she might have, been a victim of the possible serial killer. And like I said, we'll kind of cover this a little bit later, but people who are familiar with this case have kind of pointed to some things maybe not being connected to one person. Like, for example, Linda Moore. She was the only one found murdered in her house. Why? And kind of the only connection to the MO, I mean, is the MO of the suspected serial killer. She was found stabbed repeatedly. So the MO is kind of the main connection in this web of, murders that led investigators to believe there might be a serial killer on the loose. And, we don't know if he was as aggressive with them as he
Right.
was with Jane, kind of making these weird accusations. I mean, I don't know if he had a little bit of a conscience and saw that she
Mhm.
was pregnant and thought, okay, well, maybe I don't want to murder her like I did these other victims. So, I mean, there's no way for us to know how the killer conducted himself. Like I said, if this was a serial killer, there's no way for us to know how, he conducted himself because Jane was the only survivor.
Yeah, but what was with the whole girlfriend thing, right? That part was weird.
That part was weird. And I mean, there could be so many different. Maybe this guy was so evil that he dreamt up a scenario or he fantasized about a scenario where he had this girlfriend and the girlfriend was having problems with another girl. And,
Mhm.
he was actively playing that out. Some killers, they do that. They make up these scenarios in their head. They fantasize about these scenarios and then that's when they actually go out and, you know, act on those fantasies. So
Yeah.
could he have had a girlfriend? Was he really looking for, a girl that his girlfriend was having problems with? I don't know. Was he just making this fantasy up? And because
Mhm.
he wanted to just murder someone, because his goal was to take someone's life away, was he just acting out his sick fantasies? And I mean, this case is unsolved, so we just don't know.
Don't ever, if you're a woman and you're by yourself, definitely do not stop anywhere for a drink, especially, in a dark parking lot. And,
Hmm.
if anything, at least roll your windows up, lock your doors, or just
Hmm.
get away, especially if there's a weird man who pulls up next to you.
Hmm. But after the attack, Jane sustained several injuries, including 2 collapsed lungs, a cut tendon in her hand and knee, and a sliced jugular, and a laceration in her liver, which she later had to have a piece of removed. However, in spite of all of that, Jane's baby girl was unharmed, and she gave birth to her just 2 months later. So this just kind of speaks to, again, the difference between Jane's case and everyone else's case. I mean, obviously, Jane is the only survivor, but, knowing that she had another life to think about, I mean, she must have been terrified when, that situation took a turn and the guy started attacking her. And she said that he was attacking her for what felt like forever, and
Yeah.
she was just trying to do the best that she could to protect her baby. So it makes sense that, in her hand and in her knee and, in a bunch of different places, she had all these lacerations, these cuts, because I'm sure she was definitely, I mean, she was fighting for her life. She was fighting for her baby's life. Um, is courageous. I'm happy. I'm so glad that she was able to live to tell the tale. Um,
Yeah. And her
yeah,
baby survived.
yes. After Jane's condition improved after the attack, she learned that she may have been a victim of the suspected Connecticut River Valley killer. She gave police a description of the possible 1975 to 1984 Jeep Wagoner that her attacker was driving, and investigators took fingerprints from her car and took DNA from under her fingernails because, again, she was most likely trying to fight back. And during the struggle, I mean, a lot of the times you'll see this in attack victims. They'll take DNA from under your nails because, maybe there are skin cells or blood from the attacker that can help aid in the evidence process. Jane also gave police a description of what her attacker looked like and described him as about 5'7", between 150 and 160 pounds, shaven with blonde hair. In spite of the horrific attack that changed her life in more ways than one, Jane has taken control of her story and used what she endured to help families of cold cases get renewed visibility and action so that these cases may be solved one day. She has a podcast called Invisible Tears, where she actively advocates for justice for the loved ones of the victims of the Connecticut River Valley Killer. And we'll link that in the description of this video if anyone is interested. And if you've, listened to her podcast, if you subscribe to it, let us know down in the comments below. I will definitely be listening to her podcast now because, again, just the bravery, the courageousness that she exhibited, and again, fighting for her life, fighting for her baby's life. It's commendable. She's so brave. So I'll definitely be listening to her podcast. At the point of Jane's attack, the string of murders and attacks spanned about 10 years. And Jane's attack and testimony provided a much needed break in the case of the suspected serial killer. But like we mentioned earlier, 48 years after the first attack on Kathy Milliken, this case has still not been solved, and whoever perpetrated these attacks and murders still has not been brought to justice.
But I think what's so great, other than the fact that she survived, her baby survived, I'm glad that, she was at least able to get some of the killer's DNA in her fingernails. And we've seen this so many times because we've watched many, many episodes of Snapped and Forensic Files, where if a woman is attacked or anybody is attacked, it's recommended to, fight back and make sure that you get as much DNA as you possibly can from the person that's attacking you. Whether that's to scratch them. I've heard of stories where, the victims would even bite their attackers. Within regards to this story, investigators speculated as these crimes were occurring one after another, and most of them in a similar fashion, that they were dealing with a serial killer. The similarities in all of the crimes that we just mentioned, were difficult to ignore, right? Many believe that the same man could be responsible for all of these murders. And, these were the signature markings of a serial killer. The victims were all women and they were all alone. In most of these cases, the women's bodies were found in remote locations, like in the woods, and stabbed to death. One thing that I noticed, that some of the women were hitchhiking. I personally have never hitchhiked. But comment down below if you've hitchhiked. Tell us about your experience, and given the environment now, would you feel comfortable hitchhiking? I'm going to be honest, I would not. But back in the 70s and 80s, times were still fairly safe, right? At least in some parts of the country. And in this day and age, it would not be a good idea to hitchhike, honestly, especially if you are a woman, But then again, with the advancement with DNA, technology, and being able to catch killers, it is far more difficult today to commit a crime and not get caught than it was back in the 70s and the 80s. Back in the 80s, times were safer. I remember when I was in the second grade, I would walk from our house to a friend's house, which was a little over a mile. Times were just different then.
Yeah, definitely don't recommend hitchhiking. And, this all goes to say we're not trying to victim shame at all. I agree with what you said, that, back then people felt safer. And I've heard that in a lot of different cases from a lot of different people who lived life back then. People weren't locking their doors as much. And yeah, people just felt generally safer, even though, and we were talking about this the other day, even though it seemed like there were more active serial killers back then, like particularly I would say throughout the 70s to the 90s. But I mean, I think we can agree that it is much more difficult to commit a crime these days because
Mhm.
of surveillance. If you don't have a camera at your place of business, there is no excuse for that. Okay, so that's number one because of surveillance cameras. If you don't have a camera at your place of business, there's no excuse for that anymore. So stop making that an excuse. And if the cameras are not turned on, that's also not an excuse. Get cameras and make sure they're working. And two is DNA. I mean, it's actually insane how many people have been brought to justice because of familial DNA.
Mhm.
And I'm going to butcher what familial DNA is, but they can, for example, let's say someone commits a crime. Okay, they can see with familial DNA, like a father. A father has two kids. If they're suspecting that this is male DNA, let's say they have male DNA and there's a son and daughter, process of elimination, it's the son. So, yeah, and we have to put it in perspective too. I mean, this is a pretty remote region in the Northeast. At that time, DNA capabilities were not great.
Mhm.
A lot of businesses did not have surveillance cameras. So, I mean, I think that plays a role in why this case has been unsolved for so long. All of those factors, you know? But I'm not gonna say it's impossible, never say never. I'm hoping and praying that this case gets solved one day. Because the families deserve justice.
Right.
All right, so let's get into some suspects that have kind of made their way onto a list throughout the years. And there have been people who have been added to the list of suspects, kind of filtered out through the years. But let's go over the list of suspects. So I think one of the most talked about suspects, and definitely the most prominent one that I came across when I was doing research for this episode was Michael Nicolau, who was a troubled Vietnam War veteran who honestly just didn't seem like a good person. If you want to look more into this guy, go ahead. He just didn't seem like a great person. But while married to his first wife, Susan, they settled in Massachusetts and often visited Vermont as Michael had family there.
Mm.
Susan and Michael's mothers were both nurses, just like Bernice Cordemonch, Ellen Fried, and Barbara Agnew. A few months before Barbara actually disappeared, Michael visited an acquaintance at the Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center in Lebanon, New Hampshire, where Barbara worked at the time. Michael was also visiting relatives who lived not far from where Barbara was found in January 1987. So, you can kind of see this is a little bit circumstantial. He lived
Yeah.
in the area during the time of the murders, and I also read that during that time he actually owned a Jeep Wagoner. So, kind of
Mm.
circumstantial, but Michael Nicolau ultimately died in a murder-suicide after murdering his third wife, Eileen Nicolau, and her daughter, Terry Bowman. In November of 2005, Michael had broken Eileen's shoulder and attempted to run her over with his car.
Mm.
Eileen sought shelter at her sister's house in West Tampa when Michael found her and her daughter and selfishly took both of their lives before taking his own. Nicolau was also suspected of the involvement in the 1988 disappearance of his second wife, Michelle Nicolau.
Mm.
And from what I read about this case, it was more of a common law marriage. But, other than Michael clearly being capable of murder and kind of perpetually harming women and just being a terrible person, there is no official evidence linking him to the Connecticut River Valley Killings. And Jane Boroski actually initially didn't believe that Michael could have been her attacker, but then later conceded to the possibility that it could have been him. But again, no official evidence officially linking him. He was never brought to justice on any of that. Because he was a coward. And then in the fall of 1997, 47-year-old small-time drug dealer and paraplegic Gary Westover confessed to his uncle, Howard Minton, a retired Grafton County, New Hampshire deputy, that he, quote, was coerced into aiding in the murder of Barbara Agnew. According to Westover, on the night of January 10th, 1987, 3 of his friends picked him up to go on party, and they abducted and murdered Barbara. His uncle Howard reportedly gave this information, including the names of the men mentioned by Gary, to the authorities, and apparently little was done. And even more so because just 3 months later, in March of 1998, Gary would pass away. Another name that came up as a possible suspect was Terry Peter Rasmussen. According to Wikipedia, quote, Terry Peter Rasmussen was a convicted murderer and suspected serial killer who was convicted of 1 murder and linked to at least 6 more in a series of crimes that stretched across the contiguous United States between 1978 and 2002. Due to the use of his many aliases, most notably Bob Evans. Isn't that the...
I think that's a
Frozen-
restaurant chain.
Okay. Yeah, it is a restaurant chain, and they have the frozen foods. Okay, yes. Interesting. So, yeah, he was most known for that alias. And since he had many other aliases, he was named the Chameleon Killer. Rasmussen is the prime suspect in the Bear Brook murders, which took place in New Hampshire sometime between 1978 and 1980. And, kind of similar to Michael Nicolau because he lived in this region during the 1980s. He was clearly a terrible person and was capable of committing murder. Investigators questioned, whether he could be responsible for the string of killings and possibly be the suspected Connecticut River Valley Killer. But more recently, in May of 2024, investigators conducted a search at a property of someone who had been previously questioned in connection to the killings. Investigators were seen photographing an old rug, and multiple evidence containers were present during the search, including one marked biohazard. However, despite the many suspects named in the case over the years, no arrests have ever been made and no suspects have ever been captured, and the case remains unsolved to this day, going on 48 years.
Well, it's good to know that, given that in May of 2024, investigators were doing some work related to these crimes. So it's good to know that, this is not completely a closed case. However, it's truly a tragedy that after all these years, no one has been brought to justice for these heinous crimes. And, one can only imagine how Jane, as well as the other families of the murdered victims, must feel after all these years, right? Not knowing for certain if the attacker is still out there, if he could possibly attack again, or if there are more victims waiting to be found. I mean, those are things that, we need to take into consideration. But here's where things get complicated. These crimes span multiple jurisdictions, right? They didn't all occur in a single state, which meant that there were different police departments that were involved and investigative teams that were working on these cases. So collaboration may not have been as easy, especially as these crimes occurred when we didn't have access to the kind of technology that we have today. I can only imagine how difficult it was to, say, for those investigative teams and police departments, to compare notes. I mean, it would mean the two states' investigative teams would have to communicate either via phone or snail mail, or travel across their respective state lines to meet to discuss the cases. In short, communicating and collaborating was not as quick and easy to do as they are today. And, but I only hope that now, given the advancement in technology, it is far easier to communicate and work together. I would hope that this case has not gone completely cold and somehow, somewhere, someone in Vermont or either in Vermont or New Hampshire, someone is working on these cases. And as you mentioned, in May 2024, they're doing some work. So it sounds like these cases are not completely closed. But somewhere out there, someone knows the truth, right? And who knows, there could be more victims, alive and not alive, right? If anything, Jane Boroski's survival proves one thing for sure, and it's that the killer made a mistake. If that is the same killer, who could still very well be out there and alive and possibly committing more crimes that we just haven't heard about yet. And I commend Jane for her bravery and her perseverance. Thank goodness she and her baby survived that horrendous attack. But I mean, what do you think of this case? Do you think they will ever find who did it? I mean, at this point, the chances seem slim, right? After all the years that have passed. What do you think?
So, I mean, I always want to be optimistic about cold cases, and I have been seeing a lot of stories that have gone, 20, 30 plus years unsolved, and, the victim has since passed. But because of advancements in DNA, because of advancements in technology and investigating, they've gotten justice. Um, you know, Posthumously, but they've gotten justice. And so I never want to say, "Oh, I don't think this is ever going to be solved." You know what I mean? Because
Mhm.
Jane is still alive.
Yeah.
And this is an interesting part, but I was reading this story of this teenage girl in another state. I believe it was Maine, who was murdered.
Mm.
And someone said that based on Jane's description of her attacker and based on the description of this person who was last seen with this murdered teenage girl, it could have been the Connecticut River Valley Killer. He could have, after Jane survived, he may have realized, dang, I left a witness. I gotta flee. I gotta get out of here before maybe she sees me in town again.
Mhm.
So, maybe the killer left town. Maybe he went somewhere else and continued his spree there. But
Yeah.
I hope this case gets solved. I do. I mean, the reason why I wanted to cover this case anyways was because, it's been almost 50 years. It's going on 48 years that it's been unsolved. Um, it's so, I mean, just Jane's attack, the story of her attack is just terrifying.
Mhm.
And she deserves justice. I don't know if her attacker is still alive or dead, but anyone who is capable of that should be brought to justice.
Yeah. Well,
They don't
and
deserve to be walking around free.
exactly. And not to mention the other families too, right? They deserve closure. Um, but yeah, it's just, I can't even imagine. It's just devastating.
Yeah. And, like we said, we will leave a link for Jane's podcast below. I'm definitely going to give it a listen. I'm interested to see how life's been for her since the attack and, the work that she's been doing with the other families of the
Mhm.
victims who have been involved in this case. So we'll definitely leave that in the description of this episode on all platforms.
I mean, all it takes is really for somebody, especially Jane, because she was, one of the victims. All it takes is really for somebody to care, for this case and the other cases to remain open. And the good news is, for the most part, like our law enforcement or investigators, they care. They have a big heart, and they want to see, you know justice for these families, for these victims, because they know, I mean, they have families too. So it could have been their mother, their daughter, their wife.
Yeah. So, I mean, hopefully someone, because I mean, all it takes is for just one person to come through with that information that could break the case wide open. So I hope that this case does get solved. I hope that one person does come forward. But
I wonder if anyone has considered reaching out to a psychic to see if, the psychic could assist with any investigation pertaining to this case.
I mean, I didn't see anything about that when I was doing the research. That's not to say that they,
Yeah.
either Jane or the police department hasn't gone that route. I know that in order to recall some more of the details, she was put under hypnosis. But I mean, yeah, there are again several Unsolved Mysteries episodes where they have interviewed psychics
Yeah.
and, they've been able to really help solve cases. So, I mean, we don't know if that's been done. It may have or it may not have. But yeah, that's always an interesting element to a case whenever they bring in a psychic, I think.
Yeah.
But all right, that is going to be it for this episode. Like I said, we will link Jane's podcast on all platforms in the description of this episode. And let us know in the comments if you've heard of this case before. And if you want us to cover maybe any other unsolved mysteries that you feel like need more attention, we'll be happy to look into it and add it to our list. But thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Good night.
Good night.